Hollow Knight is a game I fell in love with from the very first time, and now, after having completed all its achievements, I felt that playing it was no longer enough. So, as a 3D artist, I decided to recreate its main character from scratch, 3D print it, and turn it into a real collectible piece. I wanted to make a small tribute to this game that I love so much, and obviously record the whole process for you. So, in this video, we are going to see how I brought this character to life. The little warrior who challenged the gods of Hallownest, the nameless knight from Hollow Knight. To start this project, the first thing I need is a good reference of the character. And for this case, I used the image from the game's last DLC. That way I make sure to have an accurate reference. And we are going to start by blocking the base shape. When we model characters, starting with a good silhouette is essential so that it has good readability. For that, I am going to extrude some vertices to which I apply the skin modifier, which gives volume to everything. This way, I can start blocking the limbs, and to make it smoother, I add a subdivision modifier. And with this, I can start building a very basic silhouette of my character. And I apply all the modifiers. With this, what I am doing is creating a shape that I can work with much more easily in sculpt mode. Normally, I personally like working much more in sculpt mode, since I feel there is much more creative freedom, because if we model with vertices, we have to keep other technical things in mind, and that limits the creative process a little bit. And so the topology works much better. I am going to create a remesh. This remesh recalculates the topology and gives me a new one, much cleaner, so I can work in sculpt mode. And I keep softly adjusting the silhouette of my character. To make the little cloth pieces of the cloak, what I do is take a curve and extrude it a little to have some surface. I give it a bit of volume using the solidify modifier, I smooth it using more modifiers, and with this I can manipulate all the vertices of the curve and give it the necessary movement so it feels dynamic, like in the reference image. For the head, I am simply going to grab a little cube and subdivide it. I apply the subdivision modifier so it becomes rounder, and I am going to start adjusting it manually. For this initial process, which is blocking, I can do this in multiple ways. Every artist has their own way of doing blockings, but personally, I like to start with very basic geometry, which I keep subdividing and adding volume to. The important thing at the beginning is to keep a very low level of detail so we can make big changes and not worry at all about the details. Sometimes at the beginning, we really want to add details, smooth the surface, and start polishing our model, but we have to be patient, because at this stage, the most important thing is the general silhouette, so the model has good readability. At this point, I also do not use many modifiers. I use very basic modifiers like subdivision, the mirror modifier, like in this case to duplicate the horns, and the skin and solidify modifiers to give me volume in the areas where I need it. And I also constantly jump a lot between edit mode and sculpt mode. Edit mode so I can move the vertices in a controlled way, and sculpt mode so I can move them in a much freer and more creative way. At this point, when I already have the basic structure of my character, I am going to create an armature using a meta rig, and I start aligning all the bones in the corresponding position. Since my character's limbs are so simple, since it has no hands or fingers, I can delete some unnecessary bones. I make sure to place the limbs correctly in the position they should be. And when all the bones are already placed, I am going to parent the geometry to the armature, and this way I can pose it. So, by rotating the bones, I am going to try to make a position similar to the one I have in the reference. This is a pretty dynamic position, and in the reference, the limbs are also not very clearly visible. So here I'm going to have to make several iterations until I get the desired position. First, we start by roughly placing the limbs as if the character had the legs slightly bent. And he is going to hold the sword tightly, as if it were going to be a big attack. It would be a position more or less similar to that of baseball batters, like holding the bat behind his back. Since in some parts, while posing, the geometry deforms a lot, I am going to add a corrective smooth modifier. And this smooths out a little the polygons that become too stressed. Little by little, I keep posing my character. In some parts, like in this case, I am going to have to adjust the weight of the vertices, because some bones may be influencing more geometry than I actually want. So here we have to make this small manual adjustment, and with that, the surface becomes a little smoother. When I already have an approximate pose, which already looks more or less dynamic and interesting, I can continue by placing well the rest of the objects, and then we will finish refining. Here, this curve that I had made for the cloak part, I am going to duplicate it, and I am going to place multiple copies over my character, adjusting each one very well so it integrates nicely with the rest of the body. Since this is going to be a model that will be 3D printed, we have to keep very present where the objects touch the others, because later those objects are going to be printed separately, and we are going to have to assemble it like a kind of puzzle. So, as much as possible, we have to avoid these objects intersecting. When I already have the first one in its approximate position, I am going to start duplicating it to create the rest of the copies of the cloak. For the eyes, what I do first is mark the position where I want to place them, and then I make a sphere that I deform a little bit and then place it in the same position. I'm going to remove the volume using a Boolean operation. I make sure both objects have a similar resolution so the operation works without any problem. I apply the mirror modifier and we make the cut. For this, I'm using an add-on called Bool Tool, which comes included with Blender and allows me, even after having done the operation, to still modify this geometry if necessary and adjust it better to my character. So, I make some small adjustments, and after that, I parent it to the head so it can move when I move the armature. And I can continue making adjustments in sculpt mode. Here, for example, when placing the eyes, I feel like I need to adjust some other proportions a little bit, and I can still keep refining the eyes a bit more. And that's it. With that, we already have the whole main body of the little knight. For my character's nail, which is basically his sword, I want to take the reference directly from the game. And since I want to show my little knight at his full splendor, I'm going to make it at the sword's maximum level when you already have the pure nail. Also taking advantage of the fact that it has some very beautiful engravings that would look really good in the final model. So I'm going to make the initial base also with very basic shapes. Ideally, all objects should always be started with very basic shapes to make sure the silhouettes work well. And once the final silhouette is already defined, I do a remesh so I can sculpt it. And after this, it becomes again like completely workable clay. I'm going to smooth it from all sides to define this final silhouette really well. I adjust the curved areas so it looks more organic. And for the engravings on my sword, what I'm going to do is place the reference image on top of the model and start creating a mask. Basically, with the mask brush, I'm going to paint all these engravings onto my model using the reference image as a guide. Since this model is 3D and the reference is 2D, there are some parts that, as artists, we have to interpret. But from here on, it's basically just drawing and tracing the engravings we have in the reference. For me personally, this is a pretty satisfying part to do, and I think it's also satisfying to watch how this process is done. Once I've finished drawing the mask, what I do is refine it a little using the tools in the mask menu. And when I feel satisfied with the final look, I'm going to inflate the whole model, and in this way I generate the volume of the engravings. I make sure to refine it and smooth it really well so it feels very homogeneous. I make some final adjustments, and now we can integrate it with the rest of the character. I'm going to change the position of the pivot point so it's easier to organize. I place it in my character's hands. I make some final adjustments here on the armature, and with this, the final pose would be ready. For the base, I'm going to use a very simple pedestal design, which is basically a cylinder with some extrusions. I add some support loops so I can preserve the shape of the edges really well. I add subdivisions and finish giving support to the shape. I want my character to stand on terrain similar to the terrain from the game, and this little part is going to be like dirt. Here, I'm going to add some flattened spheres that I'm going to turn into stone tiles to simulate terrain, like the one we have in Forgotten Crossroads, a level where we spend a lot of time in the game. From the top view, I make sure to smooth these stones really well and fit them closely together so they feel well integrated. And here there really isn't any complex technical process, but you do need to have a bit of artistic sense to feel that these stones look visually well balanced. I bring the knight back to see how they integrate with him, and I'm going to add a detail that I thought was very beautiful from this reference, which is some geos scattered across the floor, the coins that we normally use in the game. I'm going to explore a little with the array modifier and some other modifiers to create this shape, which is like a kind of snail shell, kind of like trilobites. I'm going to make this object follow a curve so I can coil it around itself, and in the end, I get this little snail-like shape. I'm going to add a few more details so it looks more like the in-game coin, and I'm going to add another model, another type of coin that looks like a different kind of trilobite. The idea here is to distribute some of these little coins across the surface of my base, trying to integrate them in a balanced way. Once I've finished this pedestal, I'm going to make the final adjustments to my model. I'm going to check everywhere for things I can improve. For example, here on the little body, there's a part that was covered by the cape and is very irregular. So I'm going to give it a remesh and try to smooth it much better so everything stays perfectly fluid. And just like this, I'm going to have to make many other small adjustments that I'm going to show here in fast motion. And with that, we would already have our final model. And well, if you're enjoying this video and you're interested in learning 3D modeling from scratch, I want to tell you that I have a complete beginner's course for Blender, where we cover multiple modeling techniques, material creation, and rendering. It's a pretty complete course of more than 10 hours, designed so you can learn step by step and start creating your own projects from scratch. I'll leave the link in the description. Once we've finished the model, a technical part comes next, which is the entire optimization process for 3D printing. At this point, we have to do 3 things. The first is what I'm doing right now, which is joining the objects while making sure we end up with a solid surface and no holes. This is because 3D printers need the volumes to be completely closed in order to work correctly. The second is the process I'm going to do next, which consists of cutting the objects of my model against each other so that the geometries never overlap, because if the geometries overlap, the model won't be able to be assembled and we need it to fit together like a puzzle. So here, I repeat this process on different objects of my model. Some pieces would be a little more difficult than others, but this is a completely necessary process if we want these objects to work well in real life. And the third thing we have to do here is something called joints, which are connections that will allow 2 pieces to fit into each other. For this, we mostly use Boolean operations. If you're interested in learning this whole technical process in more detail, I have a complete guide on how to do it on my Spanish channel. I will translate it soon. And in the end, we should get something like this, where all the objects fit together through these assemblies. Once our model is optimized for printing, we move on to the slicer, which is the program where we configure our models before sending them to the 3D printer. Here, basically what we're going to do is a simulation. In the slicer, we make sure the objects are compatible. For example, here the cape turned red, and the program helps us easily fix these minor errors. After that, we're going to distribute the models well on the printer base, and we're going to separate them so we can add the supports. Some supports, like the ones for this base, can be added automatically, and some other objects are more complex. For example, the head requires adding holes so we don't end up with one huge block of resin. We simulate the layers to make sure everything is working well. And here on the head, I also started by adding supports automatically, but in this case, they didn't seem appropriate to me, so I'm going to place them manually. The idea is to distribute them evenly across the whole yellow surface, which is the surface that needs to be supported. We start from the lowest point, which is the one that will be printed first, and continue upward and around those first points. Just like in the previous stage, you can find all the details of this process in the video I mentioned before. In my case, the only model where I could use automatic supports was the pedestal. For the others, I had to place them manually. And once the supports are ready, I'm going to duplicate this model to print two versions at the same time, since I want to keep one for myself and give the other one to my little sister. I can already run the simulation, and when I'm sure everything works well, I export the model to send it to my 3D printer. And well, here we're going to continue with the physical part of our project, where we're going to print it, cure it, and paint it. So I'll leave you here so you can enjoy the time lapse, and I'll see you again at the end of the video for the final result. There are many things about Hollow Knight that I've connected with deeply. It's a game that not only tells you a story, but also gives you many moments of melancholy, small details of beauty within a very tragic story. And that is exactly why I wanted to make this figure. It reminds me of the beauty that exists in the small things, no matter how difficult everything around may be. So I hope you enjoyed this whole process, and if you'd like to see another project that is more focused on video games, I'll leave this other video here for you. I'm the Parabox, and remember that in every vertex, there is a universe of possibilities.